move too much.
Okay, good. We're cooking now. So the Jewish community, you could start the Jewish...
Okay, the Jewish community, well, the Jewish population came to Montreal basically late in the 18th century, in a time when the city had become part of the British Empire. It was still a city with a majority French and majority Catholic, but they sort of stood in between the two groups, and they retained their Jewishness this way. This is not like the US. This is Canada. So Canada had a dual nature. And to be Jewish in a society where there's two majorities is an advantage because you can protect yourself from two sides. In other words, they lived in a majority of Catholic, Francophone, but there was also a strong British and Protestant community. And they sort of moved from one to the other, and that's how they remained British. And when the Great Migration of Jews from Eastern Europe began in the early 20th century, that was basically the decision to function in English, to live in English, but to adapt to the broader world. That would last until about 50 years ago.
But the culture of Montreal, the life, the spirit, was Catholic in ways that were not necessarily connected to religion.
True.
So how did, when a Jew was going around the city trying to find a place to thrive, to be there in their own home, was there a reconciliation with Catholicism and with Catholic people that was necessary?
Well, in the 19th and 20th century, at least the beginning of the 20th century, the city was Catholic and French. But the dominant group was the Anglican Protestant. It was the British Empire. So that way, they could avoid being entirely in the context of a Francophone Catholic world, and they could develop their own institutions. And they understood that the vast majority of the population was intensely Catholic in feeling and practice, and that functioned well, as long as the ability to function as well in another world, in the British world, was maintained. This duality is what made Jewish Montreal.
But why? Was Montreal a necessity? Was Montreal a place that Jews had to come?
Well, Montreal was the largest Canadian city. It was close to Europe. It was the entrance to the continent. It was the wealthiest city until the 70s. And so to come here was to come to a crossroad of economic influence, cultural, linguistic. It was a thriving place, and there's no reason why Jews wouldn't feel this was important and useful and interesting. And they adapted to the different environment here from the US, say New York or Boston. It was a city that offered a lot to Jews, and it offered prosperity and the ability to integrate into Canada, a different country from the US.
I did a documentary over the last number of years on the Weimar Republic, and obviously met a number of Jews, over 90, who talked about leaving Germany in the 30s, and one of the options was Canada.
Of course.
So, I want to tie that in just a little bit.
Well,
what happened there? Weimar Germany and into Nazi Germany, a percentage of Jews, for obvious reasons, are leaving, coming here, and why here? Canada was... There was an option of the US. There was an option of England.
Yeah. Canada, in the 20th century, offered a lot to Jews because it was a democracy. It was a developing country. It was prosperous. It was beginning to be a larger environment, a wealthier environment. And it had a lot of promises. It didn't have slavery. It didn't have a racist perspective on life, and the French-English divide could be bridged. The problem for the 30s is that Canada wasn't very open to welcoming Jews from Germany, and that's a moment. But in large part in the 20th century, before the 30s and after, Canada provided a haven for Jews from mostly the Russian Empire and Romania and Poland. And quite frankly, Montreal was at the center of this.
So Canada was not just an identity unto its own right, it was an identity that allowed for expansion for the Jews, an acceptance, a kind of neutral place, are you saying, necessarily, or?
No, not a neutral place. Part of the British Empire, but growing fast, offering openings, possibilities, gaining momentum, and expanding in the northern part of North America. So the promise of wealth and integration and accomplishment was there. Jews perceived it, and they came to this area regardless of what language was spoken in Montreal. 2 languages were spoken, and regardless of faith issues.
So French was not a big problem. That could be over.
No, because basically, if you know anything about Jewish history, Jews will adapt to any language. It's not part of Judaism to be English speaking. And they will adapt to different environments, cultural environments, as long as there's a measure of freedom and a measure of tolerance, which largely was the case here in the 20th century and until to this day. It's possible for Jews to find their own niche and to be a minority without having to pay the price of being too visible and to suffer pressure from outside, suffering discrimination. So I think it's worked quite well. The Jewish population of Montreal is about 90,000 today, divided between French and English speaking, divided between Sephardi and Ashkenazi, and economically is doing quite well and is very integrated in the fabric of the city. So it can go from French to English easily. Most Canadian Jews, at least those living in Montreal, are bilingual. Most know the 2 languages, and they can manage all the different cultures in Montreal quite well.
Let's go to the earlier, even before the Silent Revolution, where there were some signs with the asbestos strike. This must have all been good for Jews, or am I making an unfair assumption? The release from the argument against the old Catholic faith.
The Quiet Revolution of the 60s was a turning point for everyone. And it was very important for Jews because it lessened the influence of the Catholic Church, was quite conservative and traditional, and espoused a certain notion of Jews which was in part anti-Semitic, in part tolerant, and it was felt by Jews in this city historically that as Quebec moved along into the Quiet Revolution and improved the situation of the French speakers economically, this would be good for Jews as well, and it turned out to be true.
So there was more assimilation with Quebecers who were not seeing themselves as strictly Catholic? Or was there still a great separation with them for other reasons, cultural?
No, the religious separation which existed when the church was dominant lessened after the Quiet Revolution here, after the 60s. The distinctions between religions were less important. And it gave breathing room to Jews, basically. Some Jews decided to leave for Toronto for economic reasons, or some for political reasons, but those who stayed became quite adapted. And the language issue is no longer an issue for at least 20 years for the Jewish community in Montreal because of its level of bilingualism. And the issue of religion, quite frankly, is not for Jews to worry about because it's mostly a debate between people of French Canadian Catholic origins. It's a debate among the majority as to how tolerant and how welcoming and what kind of outward signs should be accepted in public.
Let's go fast forward way ahead to a few weeks ago, and then we'll go back again before we finish. Bill 21.
Yes.
How does this affect, is there a division amongst the Jewish community as to the impact? Are there just as many people who are for it or against it? How does it relate to the Jewish culture?
I would say most Jews in this city would be against it.
Against?
Yes, because it's...
So can you start the sentence again with including Bill 21 in the sentence so I don't have to put my question in? Thank you.
Yes, I would say that most Jews in the city today would be against or not favorable to Bill 21. I would say the vast majority, because it puts pressure on those who, for personal reasons, decide that they want to expose or express their religiousness. But the bill has not been designed to hurt Jews. It mostly is targeting Muslim women. Most of the people supporting the bill think there's too many Muslims, too much Islamic garb in the environment, and they want to reduce that level to almost absence. I don't think it affects the Jewish population of Montreal at all, except a very small minority. The level of adaptation is already quite high, and I don't think it modifies anything at all for Jews living in this city.
So the adaptation is due to the history of Jews adapting in general, or is the adaptation more due to the need for connection with other religions?
Well, there's been a Jewish community for more than 100 years, sizable here, so they've had ample time to adapt to Bill 21 ahead of what's going on now. And it's a debate. It's not finished. The law was passed, but there will be court cases against it. And other parties have said they will not maintain it. So it's going to go for years. It's mostly a debate within Francophone Quebec, mostly within notions of rejecting the Catholic faith entirely or tolerating outside of, in public spaces, expressions of religiosity.
How have you experienced or know of Francophones historically Catholic adapting and coming into Judaism, finding that, and how does that mix happen?
No, that's quite rare. The level of conversion into Judaism is fairly low anywhere in North America or Europe, and mostly, I would say, these are individual cases. The reverse is also true. Few Jews have converted into Catholicism in this city or in North America in general. This is because these religious realities have become less significant, and you can integrate and adapt without making the decision to come across and change your religion and become something else. It's fairly easy, I think, for people of Jewish origins in Montreal to function in French and to encounter the majority without having to become Catholics.
That would be a big. May we take a minute break?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.